Hi, this is Angus, and the lecture I'm giving today is the beginning chapter of a series of lectures on the various key industries across the full spectrum of world economy. Every lecture will be focusing on key industry that I regarded to be pivotal to the world economy. And in this first lecture, I will talk about the global semiconductor industry, specifically about the deverticalization of the semiconductor industry. In other words, the process the industry went through from being dominated by only one business model to the coexistence of multiple business models. I will divide this first lecture into two parts. In this video, the first half of this lecture, I will talk about how the emergence of the fabless industry technically deverticalized the semiconductor industry. And the second half of this lecture, I will talk about how the rise of the foundry industry effectively and truly deverticalized the semiconductor industry. As a result, the world's semiconductor landscape was completely changed. Semiconductor industry is of central importance to the world economy. I couldn't drive this point home better than Thomas Caulfield, CEO of GlobalFoundries, an American multinational semiconductor company, actually a semiconductor foundry. He once illustrated a picture of an inverted pyramid in which the global GDP of 85 trillion US dollars is predicted on a healthy and strong electronics industry of 2 trillions. And the whole electronics industry is dependent on the semiconductor market of 470 billions to create the differentiated features and products. I think those words of Tom quite elegantly stated that the semiconductor industry to the modern world economy is similar to a motor to an automobile. That the semiconductor industry playing a fundamental role in the modern world economy is a major reason that I'm giving my first world economy talk on the semiconductor industry, which nowadays is composed of integrated device manufacturers, the fabless companies, and the foundries. So multiple business models coexisting in this industry. It wasn't always like this, as the landscape of the semiconductor industry in earlier time was distinctly different, in fact, much more boring. Actually, ever since the inception of the semiconductor industry around the 60s, there was only one business model in the industry, and that business model is vertical integration. In vertical integration, plainly speaking, a semiconductor company would take care of most, if not all, of the major steps in the generation of an end integrated circuit product, from at the beginning the design of an IC product, then to the manufacturing of this IC product, down to the final step of marketing and selling this IC product to a customer, to an end user of the IC product, which is usually the likes of an computer maker or a phone maker, a consumer electronics company. So at the time, the semiconductor industry was really a world of integrated device manufacturers, a world of IDMs. And the semiconductor industry had remained this way for quite a long while until the founding of a group of pioneering fabless companies. That's roughly 2 decades later from the point at which the semiconductor industry came into being. A fabless company, just as its name implies, is a semiconductor company that doesn't own and operate a fabrication plant, doesn't own and operate a fab. Western Design Center, established in 1978 by William Munch, is considered to be the first fabless company, while Chips and Technologies, co-founded by Gordon Campbell in 1984, is one of the earliest fabless companies that truly separate the design of chips from their manufacture and achieved success. Thus, Gordon is among the very few semiconductor industrialists who are credited with pioneering the fabless business model and to devote their companies exclusively to the design and sale of an IC product while outsourcing the chip fabrication. And historically, the arrival of the fabless company was the first time a new business model appeared in the semiconductor industry, an alternative business model different to the business model of the IDMs. From then on, the semiconductor companies were no longer all vertically integrated. The majority still were, but the minority wasn't. Thus, the birth of the earliest fabless companies marked the first landmark in the deverticalization of the semiconductor industry. Hence, technically speaking, the semiconductor industry was deverticalized with the fabless company emerging. I think the founders of the earliest fabless companies are true innovators, and they deserve a lot of credits for their business model innovation. Jerry Sanders, founder of AMD, had a famous comment, quote, "Real man has fabs," end of quote. So even Jerry, a semiconductor industry luminary, was critical of this fabless business model and didn't think it would have a future. So this partly demonstrates what a groundbreaking innovation the fabless business model innovation is. Meanwhile, ironically, precisely because it was an innovation so ahead of its time, this new fabless business model hadn't been able to break through for quite a while until the first pure-play foundry started and made its name known. Why is this the case? Well, in retrospect, the fabless model looks like a great business model. Chip business overall is demanding in terms of both financial investments and technical know-how, especially the chip manufacturing segment is both capital intensive as well as technologically demanding, as it is and has been very expensive to build and run a chip fabrication plant. Meanwhile, the chip design segment requires a high degree of technical innovation, but it needs far less capital investment upfront. In fact, the chip design activity is at least one order of magnitude less expensive than the chip fabrication activity. So the inventors of this fabulous business model actually blazed a trail for the would-be entrepreneurs in the semiconductor industry by bringing down the intensive capital requirement to a moderate level through going fabless, yet still preserving the element of innovation as a company's differentiation factor and potential competitive advantage. But at the time, back at the early days of the fabless industry, there turned out to be a major problem for the fabless companies. This problem severely hindered the growth of the fabless industry at the time, and for the first several years since the birth of the fabless model, the fabless industry has never been able to account for even 1% of the semiconductor industry in terms of total sale. The problem is that the fabless company's manufacturing service providers wasn't reliable, not at all, actually. Remember, in the earliest days of the fabless industry, the chip manufacturers are all IDMs. In fact, as I mentioned earlier, most, if not almost all, semiconductor companies at the time are IDMs. So those pioneering fabless companies had no options but to contract the IDMs like TI, Intel, or Hitachi, Fujitsu, Toshiba, those big Japanese firms for manufacturing service, and the IDMs only regarded those fabless companies as side customers at best. As a matter of fact, the IDMs, and the fabless companies are downright rivals, as both the IDMs and the fabless companies were going after a common pool of customers, the consumer electronics companies. And the IDMs did treat the fabless companies as competitors. The IDMs would only take in manufacturing requests from the fabless companies only when the IDMs had excessive capacities. And even when the IDMs had excess capacities, IDMs would manufacture ICs for a fabless company. It was usually prohibitively costly for the fabless companies. By prohibitively costly, I don't mean it's financially expensive, but I mean that the IDMs often wanted to use the fabless company's design in the IDM's own products, or put the IDM's own brand name onto the end product of the fabless companies. In other words, the IDMs commonly wanted to take hold of the intellectual properties of the fabless companies that they were providing manufacturing services to. All this had led to the contractee, the fabless companies, harboring a feeling of distrust toward their contractors, the IDMs, and even resulted in litigations in a few cases. Hence, in the early days of the fabless industry, the friction between the fabless companies and their manufacturing service suppliers, all of which were IDMs, caused much dissipation to the growth of the fabless companies. As a result, the fabless industry started very small, and it also failed to grow rapidly in its first few years due to the fabless companies and their fabrication partners, the IDMs, were frenemy to each other deep down. So technically speaking, the semiconductor industry was deverticalized with the arrival of the first batch of the fabless companies, but the IDMs were still the de facto ruler of the semiconductor industry, and the business model of vertical integration was still the go-to business model for the semiconductor startups at the time. The event that marked the beginning of the effective deverticalization of the semiconductor industry is the founding of the first pure-play foundry, semiconductor foundry, Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, or otherwise known as TSMC. From that time forward, the semiconductor industry truly started to be deverticalized. And this would constitute the second half of this lecture and would be presented in the next video.